Isla Bennett had always believed in the power of stories. As a part-time library assistant, books were not just her job, they were her escape. They offered the warmth that life had never given her. Growing up in foster care, Isla learned early that kindness often went unnoticed. She had never known what it felt like to have a real home, to have someone waiting for her at the end of the day. But she refused to dwell in self-pity. Instead, she worked tirelessly, spending her mornings at the library and babysitting at night, just to make ends meet. Her life was quiet, predictable, and lonely, but she managed, until that rainy afternoon. As Isla restocked the shelves, her eyes landed on a small boy sitting near the window. He was silent, withdrawn, his wheelchair slightly angled away from the bookshelf. A book rested on his lap, but what caught Isla's attention was not the book. It was the loneliness in his gaze. Minutes passed as she watched him struggle to reach for a book on a higher shelf. His small hands stretched upward, but no matter how much he tried, the book remained just beyond his grasp. Something in Isla's chest tightened. Without a second thought, she set down the book in her hands and stepped toward him. Isla walked toward the boy slowly, careful not to startle him. When she stopped beside him, he glanced up. His blue eyes, striking and intense, reminded her of the sky just before a storm. "Need some help?" Isla asked, gently. The boy blinked, surprised, as if he wasn't used to being noticed. Isla smiled, reaching for the book he had been struggling to grab and placing it in his lap. "Here you go." Ben stared at the book, his fingers tracing the title, The Brave Knight and the Starlit Queen. "I know this one," Isla said, crouching to meet his eye level. "It's a great story." Ben nodded. "I read it. A long time ago." There was something about the way he held the book, like it was something precious, something more than just paper and ink. "Would you like me to read it to you?" she asked, her voice soft but sincere. Ben's blue eyes widened slightly. "Really? If you want," she added quickly, not wanting him to feel pressured. A long pause, then finally he nodded. Isla smiled, pulling up a chair next to him and opening the book. Her voice was warm and animated, breathing life into the characters on the pages. Ben listened intently, and when Isla changed her voice to match each character, a small, unexpected laugh escaped from his lips. For the first time that day, his eyes sparkled with something other than loneliness. And neither of them noticed that, from a distance, someone was watching. Somewhere across the city, Chris Dalton sat in his high-rise office, his eyes locked on the screen in front of him. The video footage was brief security camera footage from the library. At first, he hadn't paid much attention. Strangers occasionally showed kindness to Ben, but none of them ever stayed. They offered pity, then disappeared. But this woman, she was different. Chris studied the screen carefully. Isla Bennett hadn't just helped his son reach a book. She had listened. And when she read to him, when she animated the characters, when she made him laugh, that laugh, how long had it been since he had last heard it? Leaning back, Chris folded his arms, his expression unreadable. He was used to people wanting something from him. Money, influence, power. But Isla had no idea she was being watched. She had no reason to pretend. He turned to his assistant. "Find out everything about her." The assistant gave a curt nod. "Yes, Mr. Dalton." Chris looked back at the screen. Isla Bennett. He didn't know who she was, but he knew one thing. She had made his son smile again, and that made him want to know more. The next day, Isla returned to the library as usual, but something felt different. As she walked into the children's section, Ben was already there, sitting in the exact same spot as the day before, waiting. He saw her first, and the moment their eyes met, he asked, his voice filled with quiet hope, "Can you read to me again?" Such a simple request, and yet it carried a weight that Isla couldn't ignore. She smiled, settling into the chair beside him. "Of course." And just like that, a routine began. Every afternoon, Isla read to Ben. They lost themselves in stories of knights, princesses, grand adventures, and magic. At first, Isla was the one telling the stories, but little by little, Ben started sharing his own. He spoke of the books his mother used to read to him before she passed away. He talked about the adventures he wished he could have, running like the knights in his stories, exploring a world without limits. Isla listened. She never interrupted, never pitied him. She simply listened. And Ben noticed. For so long he had felt invisible, like people only saw his wheelchair and not him. But with Isla he felt like any other child, and that changed everything. But Isla had no idea that from a distance, Chris was still watching. He wasn't just reviewing security footage anymore. He had started arriving at the library early, finding a quiet corner where he could see Isla and his son. For the first time in years, he saw Ben truly happy. And Chris Dalton found himself unable to look away from Isla Bennett. Isla was rearranging books on the shelves when she felt it. A presence. She turned around. Standing a few feet away was a tall, sharply dressed man. He carried himself with an air of authority, one that demanded attention without a single word. She knew exactly who he was. Chris Dalton, billionaire, business mogul, and most importantly, Ben's father. But his eyes weren't as cold as the ones she had seen in magazine photos. They were intense, calculating, studying her with quiet scrutiny. "You're the one who's been reading to my son." His voice was deep, controlled. Isla blinked, caught off guard for only a second before steadying herself. "Yes." Chris didn't move, his gaze unwavering. "Why?" he asked. A simple question, but there was something in the way he said it that made Isla hesitate. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" Chris spoke slowly. "What do you want out of it?" A flicker of irritation rose in Isla's chest. "I don't want anything," she said firmly. "I just like reading to Ben." A long pause. Chris held her gaze, searching for something. Then, just for a split second, something unreadable flickered across his face. "Interesting." And with that, he turned and walked away. Isla let out a slow breath, realizing she had been holding it. She had no idea that this moment was only the beginning of something that would change her life forever. 2 days after their meeting at the library, Isla received a text from an unknown number. "Chris Dalton, I want to meet, 7 p.m. Le Vienne." She frowned at the screen. No explanation. No indication if this was an invitation or an order. But from what she knew of Chris Dalton, it was definitely an order. And she also knew she couldn't refuse. When Isla stepped into the luxurious restaurant, she immediately felt out of place. The chandeliers glowed overhead, the tables were draped in pristine white linens, and the elegantly dressed patrons moved as if they belonged to another world. But Chris belonged here. He was already seated, composed, exuding the effortless confidence of a man who controlled everything around him. When she approached, he simply gestured for her to sit. "I don't like wasting time," Chris began, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. "I need you to help Ben." Isla hesitated. "What do you mean?" Chris leaned back slightly, his voice steady. "The doctors say Ben has a chance to walk again with the right therapy, but he doesn't believe in it. He's accepted his condition. He's afraid to hope." His tone remained controlled, but Isla caught the flicker of something deeper beneath it. Concern. "You're the only person he trusts. I need you to be there for him." Isla tightened her hands in her lap, overwhelmed. This wasn't just about reading to a child anymore. This was a real responsibility. She swallowed. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Chris studied her for a moment, then said, "I want you to move into my home." Isla's eyes widened. "What?" "I'll pay you well. You won't have to worry about money again," Chris said, his voice calm but resolute. "In return, you'll be with Ben throughout his therapy. You'll help him believe he can do this." Isla's heart pounded. This was too much. Too big. She looked at Chris, the powerful, composed billionaire sitting across from her. But then she thought of Ben, the boy with hopeful eyes whenever she read to him. And suddenly, she knew her answer. Taking a deep breath, she met Chris's gaze. "All right, I'll do it." 3 days later, Isla stood at the gates of the Dalton estate, a small suitcase by her side. She had never seen anything so grand. Towering marble columns, massive glass windows that shimmered under the afternoon sun. The wrought iron gates slowly swung open, and Isla felt her pulse quicken. She didn't belong here, but she wasn't here for Chris Dalton. She was here for Ben. A butler escorted her inside. The estate was so vast that Isla could hear the echo of her own footsteps against the polished marble floors. Expensive paintings lined the walls, and crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high they seemed endless. Everything was too perfect, too foreign. She swallowed hard as the doors to the sitting room opened. Ben was there, sitting in his wheelchair, his eyes going wide when he saw her. "Isla?" She smiled, stepping closer. "I told you, didn't I? I always keep my promises." Chris stood nearby, watching them. He didn't say a word, but there was a flicker of quiet satisfaction in his gaze. A butler led Isla to her room, but it wasn't just a room. It was a private suite, complete with a sitting area and a view of the estate gardens. Isla set her suitcase down, feeling slightly overwhelmed. But then she remembered the way Ben had looked at her, and she knew she had made the right choice. Starting tomorrow, she would be by his side as he embarked on the hardest journey of his life. And she had no idea that in the process, she would be changed forever too. The first few days at the Dalton estate passed in a blur of routine. Every morning, Isla accompanied Ben to his therapy sessions. Every afternoon, she helped him practice at home. Some days, he made progress. Other days, he wanted to give up. Isla never left his side, pushing him forward through every obstacle. And Chris, despite his demanding schedule, watched them closely. He often stood from a distance, silently observing as Isla encouraged Ben through each painstaking step. For the first time in years, he saw his son believe in himself again. One evening, Isla sat outside in the garden, gazing at the quiet night sky. She didn't notice Chris approaching until his deep voice cut through the silence. "What are you thinking about?" She turned, slightly startled, but then smiled. "Ben. He's stronger than I ever imagined." Chris nodded, his expression softer than usual. "Because of you." Isla let out a quiet laugh. "I think it's mostly because of him." Silence settled between them. They both knew the past few days hadn't just changed Ben, it had changed them, too. Chris looked at Isla under the moonlight, realizing that for the first time in his life, he wanted to believe in something beyond business and power. And Isla, for the first time, felt her heart begin to beat for someone other than Ben. That day started like any other. Isla took Ben to his morning therapy session, guiding him through the exercises, encouraging him every step of the way. But something felt different today. Ben was more determined, less hesitant. After dinner, as Isla was about to leave his room, Ben suddenly spoke. "Isla?" She turned back. "What is it, Ben?" He bit his lip, hesitating, then said quietly, "I want to try standing." Isla froze. "I don't know if I can," he admitted, "but if you're here." Without a moment's hesitation, Isla stepped closer, her eyes filled with unwavering faith. "Let's try." Ben nodded, his small hands gripping the armrests of his chair. Isla placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, not to hold him up, just to remind him she was there. Ben took a deep breath, and then, slowly, he pushed himself up. For the first time in years, he was no longer sitting in his wheelchair. Chris walked in at that exact moment. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the sight. His son, standing on his own, though his legs trembled beneath him. Ben looked up, meeting his father's gaze. A bright, triumphant smile broke across his face. "Dad, I did it." And in that moment, not just Ben, but Isla and Chris too, knew that he had finally conquered the fear that had held him back for so long. Over time, Isla had become an irreplaceable part of the Dalton household. Ben grew stronger every day, no longer afraid of falling. Whenever he stumbled, Isla was always there to help him up, always there to remind him to keep going. And Chris, he changed too. He found himself spending less time at work, drawn home by something he couldn't quite name. Some nights he stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching Isla laugh with Ben, the sound of their happiness filling the once empty halls. He told himself it was because of Ben, that she was helping his son heal, but deep down, He knew the truth. Isla wasn't just changing Ben's life, she was changing his too. One evening, after tucking Ben into bed, Isla sat on the edge of his mattress, gently adjusting his blanket. Ben stared at her for a long moment before whispering. I was like, "Did my mom send you down to take care of me and Dad?" Isla froze, her heart tightening at his words. She gave him a soft smile, cupping his cheek. "I don't know, Ben, but if she did, I'd be honored." Ben beamed up at her, eyes full of trust. "Then don't ever leave." She squeezed his hand. "I won't." But as she stepped outside into the garden, she realized her own heart was still searching for an answer. That was when Chris appeared. "Isla." She turned, meeting his gaze, no longer distant or guarded, but raw and unshaken. "I don't just need you for Ben," he said, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "I need you for me." This time, Isla didn't push away what she already knew in her heart. She took a step closer, teasing, "And what if I say no?" Chris smirked. "I won't accept that." A quiet laugh escaped her lips before she whispered, "I don't want to leave either." Chris didn't wait any longer. He pulled her in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips, a silent promise that she had changed his world forever. Time passed, and Isla had become an irreplaceable part of the Dalton household. Ben grew stronger, not just physically but in spirit. He believed in himself, in his own strength, and Isla was the one who had given him that belief. And Chris, he changed too. He was no longer a man consumed by work. He spent more time at home, more time with his son and with Isla. One evening, after tucking Ben into bed, Isla stepped into the garden, letting the cool air calm her thoughts. She didn't know that Chris was waiting for her. "Isla." She turned, finding him standing there, not distant, not unreadable, but open. Chris stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "I've spent too many years chasing things that never truly mattered. But you made me see what does." Isla parted her lips to respond, but then Chris lowered himself onto one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I used to think love was a distraction, something that made men weak, but you proved me wrong. Every time I see you with Ben, every time I hear you laugh, I realize what I've been missing. Isla, you didn't just change Ben's life. You made me believe in something again, and I never want to lose that." Isla's breath hitched, tears stinging her eyes. Chris held her gaze, steady and unshaken. "Marry me, Isla." And in that moment she realized she had fallen for this man long ago. She didn't need to think. Isla nodded, her voice trembling but firm. "Yes." Chris rose to his feet, pulling her into his arms before pressing a deep, lingering kiss against her lips, a promise that from this moment on she would never be alone again. And from the window, Ben watched them with a knowing smile. Softly, he whispered, as if speaking to his mother in heaven, "Mom, Dad finally found the person you sent to us."